And tonight, I am very pleased to introduce our guest author, Adolfo Ovies. He migrated to the United States from Cuba in June of 1960, making his new home with his grandmother in Connecticut, became immersed in a New England Yankee culture, and flourished as a young historian at school while attending Fairfield Jesuit Prep School. And this was not far from Gettysburg. So he was able to visit the battlefield when he was just 10 years old. And that was certainly a momentous occasion for him. And another thing that greatly influenced him was watching Errol Flynn in They Died with Their Boots On. And it's not only captured the elusive nature of Custer's flamboyant personality, but provided Adolfo with an intriguing hero. And in spite of the historical inaccuracies of that movie, this inspired him to want to learn more about George Custer. So tonight, he is here to talk about his first book in a trilogy, The Boy Generals, George Custer, Wesley Merritt, and the Cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. So I will turn the screen over to our guest author.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Kelly. Just want to make sure that we are seeing the PowerPoint presentation. Is that on?
Let me see here. Looks like you need to share screen.
Okay, and go to the one we talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And there we go.
Perfect.
That should have it, right?
Right, I can see it.
Okay, it doesn't have the bar across the top of it, does it? Okay.
I think you should be good if you just use those arrows. You might need to click your screen first too. Perfect.
Okay. All right. So, well, I thank everybody for joining tonight's presentation of the Boy Generals, George Custer, Wesley Merritt, and the Cavalry of the Army of the Potomac. Today we will be discussing volume 1 of my trilogy. Volume 1 spans the time period from the time of their tenure at West Point, Wesley Merritt and George Custer at West Point, and it goes through to the third day of the Battle of Gettysburg. In Merritt's case, that would be South Cavalry Field, and in Custer's case, that would be East Cavalry Field. Before going any further, I do want to make mention of the spectacular cover on the book. It was an original oil painting by the artist Bruce K. Laws. And if anybody wants to see his work, it is the address is bklawsart.com. It's at the bottom of the page. And when you look at this guy's artwork, and he's not exactly a Civil War artist, he's more of a animal artist, you would think that you were looking at a photograph. So I did want to mention the fact that, you know, he did provide the cover for this book and will provide the covers for the next 2 volumes. And he's just a spectacular artist. So getting back to the subject of the Boy Generals, George Custer, Wesley Merritt, there couldn't have been 2 guys that were more different in their temperament, their personality, and for the sake of this study, in their tactical philosophies. George Custer was what was called a hussar, which in the old European cavalry model was light cavalry. They were armed with pistols and sabers, and they were considered to be the eyes and ears of the cavalry of the army. And dragoons, Wesley Merritt was a dragoon. The dragoons were trained to fight on foot. They were armed with carbines, and that's what, when he graduated, he went on to the 2nd U.S. Dragoons in the Utah territory, and that's how he spent the first years of his career. When you look at these two pictures, nothing can show you the difference more than the color pictures on the left and the black and white pictures on the right. Up above on the left-hand side, you have a dragoon with his carbine. You can see it's a very utilitarian uniform, nothing fancy about it. These guys were trained to fight on horseback or on foot. It just depended on the commander. And when you look at the picture of Wesley Merritt, you see him in a very standard frock coat of a brigadier general, nothing fancy about it whatsoever. And then when you go down to the bottom picture, you see a hussar, the light cavalry of the European cavalry. And it's gold and lace and the pelisse and the furs and the hat, that the big hat. And it's just very gaudy, very flamboyant. And then when you go to the right-hand picture and you see George Custer in his uniform, it's the famous black velveteen uniform, so unlike anything else in the Union Army. He has gold lace all the way up to his elbow. He's wearing a sailor shirt from a Navy gunboat with a star on it. And, he's flamboyant looking. He's got his long blonde hair all the way down to his shoulders. He was a spectacular figure on the battlefield. So just a couple of weeks ago, I went to Gettysburg, and I did a book signing up there for the Savas Beatty publishers, and it was a meeting of the writers and many of the readers. There must have been over 100 readers present at that. So I got to sign quite a few books and had a lot of conversations with these people. And they asked me two questions, or they made two statements. One was, first of all, they didn't know that there was more than just a spirited enmity, because that's what they called it back in those days, was that Custer and Meritt had a spirited enmity. It wasn't. It was a bitter, hateful, it was just a bitter enmity between the two men that developed when they became generals and moved on to the end of the war. And the other question was, well, they didn't know that there was an enmity between Custer and Meritt. And then the other question was, well, who the heck was Wesley Merritt? George Custer's had hundreds and hundreds of books written about him. There's 2 dozen books written about the guy every year. And yet about Wesley Merritt, there's only one full-length biography. It was written by Donnie Alberts, and that's the only biography of Merritt. So the question then becomes, well, how do we know that there was such a bitter enmity between Custer and Merritt? And to do that, we need to move just a little bit into the future. We need to move to 1879. Obviously, everybody knows that George Custer got killed at the Little Bighorn with all of the 5 companies that accompanied him on June 25 of 1876, and there were no survivors. Frederick Whitaker, who had fought during the Civil War, published a book shortly after Custer's death. It was called The Complete Life of General Armstrong Custer. And in it, he made the charge that Major Marcus Reno, who was second in command to Custer, had disobeyed his orders and accused him of cowardice. And he kept after the War Department for 3 years to try and get some action against Reno. And finally, in January of 1879, the Army finally convened what came to be called as the Reno Court of Inquiry, and it was held in Chicago. And one of the members, the Board of Inquiry was composed of 3 members, and one of the members was Lieutenant Colonel Wesley Merritt, who at that time was in command of the 5th Cavalry, the 5th U.S. Cavalry. And needless to say, after weeks of testimony, somehow or other, the Court of Inquiry arrived at the conclusion that, first of all, Reno had not been guilty of disobedience of orders, and he had not been a coward. He was accused of cowardly acts, but the Court of Inquiry decided that that was not the case. Though they did state that other officers had shown more courage, more activity than Reno, they did not in any way or shape or form accuse Reno of these acts. Sitting in the hall where the inquiry was held was Elizabeth Bacon Custer, George Custer's widow, and Frederick Whitaker. And Whitaker stormed out of the meeting after the verdict was delivered and accused Merritt of being the person that had written the verdict, which didn't exactly exonerate Reno, but by the same token, it didn't bring what he called animadversion, which is kind of like a funny word, but you know, there was no negative action directed towards Reno. So he accused Merritt of being the person that wrote that report. Obviously, Libby Custer spent the rest of her life, she never remarried. She was a widow until she died at the age of 90 something. And she spent the rest of her life trying to secure the legacy of her husband. And that began shortly after the Reno Court of Inquiry. In August of 1879, she found out that a committee had been formed to create a monument to George Custer at West Point. The problem was that they weren't able to raise enough money to create an equestrian statue of the general. So they ended up creating a statue in which he was on foot, and it shows Custer, and you can see the picture on the left there. That's the statue that was created. It shows him holding a revolver in one hand and the saber in the other. And Libby was just shocked to the core. First of all, no one had consulted with her in the creation of the statue. So she felt completely left out of the process. And then on top of that, she claimed that all of her husband's greatest battles had been on horseback with the saber. So this picture, she said that she told a friend of hers that he looks like a desperado. And she was, when the statue was finally shown at West Point in late August, I think it was August 30th of 1879, she refused to attend the ceremonies, and none of her friends and her entourage showed up. So she completely ignored it. On the bottom of the statue, you can see the place where the statue was actually located, and it overlooks the Hudson River, and it has a pedestal, and then the statue itself. And things started moving. She spent the next 3 or 4 years trying to get that statue removed. And it was just one of those things that in 1882, Wesley Merritt was appointed to be the superintendent at West Point. And the whole situation with the statue just kind of dropped into his lap. And at that point, Libby remembered the fact that Wesley Merritt was the one that had written a report exonerating Marcus Reno, and she wasted no further time and decided to go straight to the top of the Army which at that time was William Tecumseh Sherman. And she would write to Sherman the following. She said, "Years ago, I knew, not from my husband, that General Merritt was his enemy. On the plains, we entertained him, and he seemed to have conquered his enmity and jealousy that was so bitter in the Army of the Potomac. But when he was placed at the head of the court of inquiry that sat to investigate Colonel Reno's conduct at Chicago, I saw how General Merritt still felt toward his dead comrade." So that's the thing that got me going on what turned out to be 3 volumes investigating the relationship between George Custer and Wesley Merritt. So in a way, it's kind of interesting to say that I'm not really writing a history book concerning the movements of the Cavalry Corps and things like that, as much as I am writing the story of 2 men who came to detest each other throughout the years of the Civil War. So in order to understand exactly how this dysfunctional relationship came to take place, we need to do 2 things. The first thing we need to do is we need to dispel a lot of the mythology that surrounds George Custer's persona. Like I say, over the years, hundreds of books, many of them outright lies, many of them made up, whatever, but they've created this legendary figure that died heroically on the slopes of the Little Bighorn. And then the other thing we need to do is, since Wesley Merritt has only had 1 biography written about him, we need to look at the enigma that is Wesley Merritt. We need to bring his persona out in the open. And the way I did that was by reading his official reports, by reading, he wrote extensively after the war. He was the founder of a group called the United States Cavalry Association, and he wrote extensively in what was called the Journal of the U.S. Cavalry Association, and laid out his beliefs on the use of cavalry. Wesley Merritt served a long term in the U.S. Army and died in 1906, just before the start of World War I. But he was a tremendous soldier who reached his peak after the war. During the war, he was considered a great general. But then after the war, he was the man that was in charge of during the Spanish-American War, he was in charge of the Philippine expedition. And in his writings in the Journal of the U.S. Cavalry Association, he was the one that put forth what he believed was important in moving the U.S. Army from being an army that was fighting the Native Americans on the Western frontier to an army that was capable of taking on the European powers in what eventually turned out to be World War I. So when the U.S. Army went to war in Europe, it was because of Wesley Merritt's efforts to move the army into a modern army. And that brings us back to, well, at any rate, let me finish the story of the Custer statue. Finally, in 1884, Abraham Lincoln's son, Robert Lincoln, was the Secretary of the Department of War. And in 1884, he ordered the statue to be taken down. And the only thing that was left was the pedestal. The statue itself was taken down, boxed up, and stored in a warehouse, and it was never, ever seen again, and it has not been found to this day. In 1906, the pedestal, they added a spire to the pedestal, and that's what exists as Custer's tomb at West Point to this day. Okay, so let's get back to West Point. Wesley Merritt was a graduate from the class of 1860. He was, well, the class of 1860 was the only class that actually had 5 terms. And that at that time, the Secretary of War was the soon to become President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis. And at that time, the West Point Academy was under the control of the engineering department of the U.S. Army. And Jefferson Davis felt that there was just way too much mathematics and too much engineering and not enough soldiering. So he decided to add a 5th term to the class. And Merritt graduated in 1860. He was actually he joined the academy in 1855. When he received his appointment as 2nd lieutenant, he was assigned to the 2nd United States Dragoons stationed in the Utah Territory. And the funny thing about the whole thing is that there is, and I've checked, Lord knows I've checked with West Point and everybody, there are no known photographs of Wesley Merritt as a cadet at West Point. The picture on the right is George Custer. George Custer was a member of the class of 1861. He flirted continuously with the demerits. At that time, you were allowed 100 demerits per term. And if you hit 100 demerits, you're going to be dismissed from the academy. And George Custer came close every year to that. He was just a fun-loving guy. His classmates loved him, but he would go on to say that his tenure at West Point was an example to be forgotten. No one should have used him as a role model. Then in the closing days of his tenure, when he was a senior and the war was starting to break out, he was serving a tour of duty as officer of the guard. And a couple of the new cadets got into a fight. And it was his job to stop the fight. And instead, he stood between the 2 plebs, they were called, and he shouted, "Let there be a fair fight, boys." And the officer of the day heard the commotion, came and saw that there was a fight going on and that Custer had completely failed in his duties to keep the peace and tranquility of the academy, and placed him under arrest, and he was court-martialed. Before he could be court-martialed, before his sentence was delivered, the war broke out. And his classmates had already gone down to Washington. They intervened in his behalf, and the need for trained officers with the beginning of the war came to his aid and basically saved his career. So he graduated class of 1861, was nearly expelled. He would have a sterling career during the war. When Merritt went west, he came under the auspices of 2 mentors. One was Brigadier General Philip St. George Cooke. St. George Cooke was the commanding officer of the 2nd U.S. Dragoons. And to be honest with you, he was a paradox. He was commanding a regiment of dragoons trained to fight on foot, and yet he was one of the biggest advocates of the mounted cavalry charge that existed in the U.S. cavalry at the time. So Merritt idolized the guy. He would come to his defense after he, I guess he gained infamy at the Battle of Gaines' Mill, and Merritt would spend the rest of his career defending St. George Cooke. He idolized St. George Cooke. The other mentor that he had was, at that time, Captain John Buford. And Buford was captain of his company. By that time, the war drums were beating in the east, and the Second Dragoons received their orders to march across the country and head towards the Eastern Theater of War. So on the night, on a trip that took like 2 months to get from Utah to the Eastern Theater, Buford would sit around the campfire with Merritt, and they'd, the campfire would be going, and they'd be taking a little pull off their flasks of whiskey, and Buford would train Merritt in the rudiments of cavalry operations. Custer and Meritt hadn't met at this time. Custer was the first one to see action when he participated in the Battle of First Bull Run. By that time, Merritt had established a great reputation as being a solid soldier. Custer was headed in the opposite direction. He was getting an unenviable reputation as a hardcore drinker and a curser. He had served under Phil Kearny, who was one of the foulest mouths in the U.S. Army, and had just picked up right from there. And you can see from the picture on the right-hand side that Custer is sitting in front of a group of staff officers, and you can see a bottle of wine, a couple of bottles of whiskey, empty glasses. Libby would later go, his wife, Elizabeth Bacon Custer, would later go on to say that Custer never did anything half-assed. If he was going to do something, he did it all the way. And when he started drinking, he was a hardcore drinker. So he was obviously on the wrong path at this time. And you can see on the map on the left, Fortress Monroe was where the Army of the Potomac landed, and they began moving up the peninsula towards Richmond. And the first place they came to was Yorktown. And Custer at that time was assigned to the topographical engineers under General John G. Bernard. And as they approached Yorktown, he was astounded to find out that he had been seconded to the aeronautical balloonists of Professor Theodore Thaddeus Lowe. And in his unfinished, unpublished memoirs, he writes about his trips in the balloon over the Confederate lines, and he was scared out of his wits. He had two theories. One of them was that the bottom was going to fall out of the basket and he was going to plummet to the ground, or some Confederate sharpshooter was going to take a pot shot at the balloon, put a hole in it, and the balloon was going to just collapse, and the same thing was going to happen. He was going to end up at the bottom. At the same time, Wesley Merritt, who had been serving as an aide-de-camp to Philip St. George Cooke, well, Philip St. George Cooke became the first commander of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, and he assigned Merritt to be his aide-de-camp. And unfortunately, in the course of obviously anybody who's read about the Civil War knows that the Peninsula Campaign was a disaster for McClellan. And after he got to a certain point, he started retreating south to the James River after the Battle of Gaines Mill. And at the Battle of Gaines Mill, Philip St. George Cooke had ordered a hussar-style charge of cavalry, which ended up being a disaster. And he would, when they got to the James River, he would tender his resignation, and Merritt would end up without a job. By the same token, McClellan, the campaign was a disaster, and he was relieved when he was eventually relieved by Abraham Lincoln. Then George Custer was without a job. So both of our protagonists are at this point in the war where, hey, we don't have jobs. What are we going to do? 20 days, the picture of Custer drinking with his staff officers was taken on May 20th. This picture here of Custer crossing the Chickahominy River took place a week later. And the guy on horseback is John G. Bernard, the engineer of the Army of the Potomac. And they were reconnoitering the crossings of the Chickahominy River. And Bernard had already scoped out a couple of places and found out that the Confederates had destroyed all the bridges crossing the Chickahominy. And finally, they get to New Bridge, and Bernard sees Custer loitering about and decides to take him with him to the crossing of the Chickahominy at New Bridge and tells him to jump in the water and go across the river and scope out the Confederate positions. So Custer pulls out his revolver, hops into the Chickahominy, and makes his way across the river onto the south side where the Confederates were, and does his little reconnoitering of the things. The only thing is, he was under strict orders from Bernard to get over and get back as soon as possible. But that just wasn't the Custer style, and he overstayed his visit while Bernard was going crazy on the other side, signaling for him to come back, come back. And finally, Custer comes back. And to Bernard's credit, he takes Custer and introduces him to George B. McClellan, who was commanding the Army of the Potomac. And McClellan looks at Custer and says, you know, you're just the kind of bold person that I'm looking for. And he asks him if he wants to serve on his staff. And Custer right away tells McClellan, yeah, I'd love to serve on your staff. And years later, after Custer's death, McClellan would write to Libby Custer and say, you know, at the time, he asked nothing of me. All he wanted to do was just to serve on my staff. And Custer served on McClellan's staff, not only when he was relieved of his command, but when McClellan went to write his report on the Peninsula Campaign, he asked for Custer, and Custer went up to New York City and assisted McClellan in writing the report. Of course, after McClellan was fired from his job, there were several other generals that took command of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac. There was George Stoneman, who led the famous Stoneman Raid, which took place at the same time that Hooker was leading the ill-fated battle at Chancellorsville. And of course, everybody knows that Chancellorsville was a disaster. Stonewall Jackson came in on the flank of the army and completely routed it. And Hooker, following the army, the army politics of the Army of the Potomac, which was politically ridden, decided he needed to get rid of Stoneman. So Stoneman had taken a leave of absence for medical reasons, and Pleasanton was appointed to command the Cavalry Corps. Now, Pleasanton had been a member of the 2nd U.S. Dragoons out in the Utah Territory, and he already knew Merritt. And he knew Custer because Custer had served on McClellan's staff and had, on many occasions, ridden to Pleasanton and delivered orders to him. So when Pleasanton took over the Cavalry Corps of the Army of the Potomac, he appointed Custer and Merritt to his staff. Merritt didn't last long. He barely made it to 2 weeks on the staff. Merritt was a regular. He had served on the frontier. He had served with regulars like St. George Cook and Buford, and the traditions and regulations of the regulars were imbued in his spirit. He was a soldier. He was a fighter, and being on the staff was not what he wanted. So 2 weeks after he was appointed to Pleasanton's staff, he asked for a transfer back to a line unit, and that request was granted. And when he packed his saddlebags and went back to a fighting unit, he couldn't have been happier. There were several things. This was probably about the first time that we see the first crack in the relationship between Custer and Merritt. And there were several factors involved in this. The first thing was their choice of mentors. Okay, on the one hand, we have Merritt with Philip St. George Cook, who got the blame for the disaster at Gaines Mill. On the other hand, we have Custer, who served under George McClellan until McClellan's tenure was over. Merritt was a little bit of a stickler, a little bit of a martinet. He was not a forgiving person, and he did not forgive McClellan for causing the ruination of Philip St. George Cook's career. So he never forgave McClellan, and by extension, he already had a bone to pick with Custer. Another factor that kind of rankled Merritt was the fact that at West Point, George Custer, being the fun-loving, bon vivant kind of guy that he was, he had a Confederate, or what was soon to become a Confederate soldier, as his roommate, and he was friends with a lot of the Southern boys, people like Stephen Ramseur and Tom Rosser, Gimlet Lee. All these people were Custer's friends, and he loved them all. I mean, there's a story of Gimlet Lee's wedding, which took place on the south side of the deep in enemy territory. And Custer was invited to serve as the best man. And here he is in a room full of Confederates dressed in their full dress uniforms, and he's dressed in Union blue, serving as best man, and the Confederate girls are just swooning all over him. So this kind of rankled Merritt because he viewed the fact that these Southern cadets had sworn an oath to the Union, and then they had resigned and taken up service with the Confederate Army. So that was another thing that bothered Merritt. And the third thing that really kind of rankled Merritt a lot was the fact that Custer was such a fun-loving, prankster type of guy. In his off-duty hours, he was probably a little bit obnoxious, maybe a little too overboard. Merritt was not that kind of guy. He was a serious, serious man. And we don't even know if Merritt actually had a sense of humor. I've got a story in the book that I put in there that took place in the 1870s when Custer had gone on to become a famous hunter and stuff. And, if you guys want, read the book. The story is in there. It's on chapter 5. And it's a story of Merritt going out west and to a buffalo hunt with Custer. And it's just hilarious what Custer did to him, because Custer never forgave Merritt for disliking him. And like I say, by the end of the war, they were bitter enemies, and Custer just couldn't. He had to play one last prank on Merritt, and that's in the book. So you should read that. It's hilarious. It's a hilarious story. So, let me go back. So that brings us to the Battle of Brandy Station. And if you recall, one of the things that we talked about was the fact that in order to understand the relationship between Custer and Merritt, we had to do two things. We had to look at the mythology that surrounded Custer, and we had to bring into question the enigma that was Wesley Merritt, because Wesley Merritt was not a writer. When Custer died, years later, Marguerite Merrington, after Libby's death, found trunkfuls of papers that Custer had written to Libby, and official reports and all kinds of stuff, all of which are housed at the library in New York City, the main library at New York City. Merritt, man, the only thing that you can find about him are his official reports, accounts from people that fought with him, and his writings in the Journal of the U.S. Cavalry Association. So if we're going to look at these two things, we need to look at the Battle of Brandy Station. Brandy Station took place on June 9th. The Confederates under Jeb Stuart had massed on the south side of the Rappahannock River, and they had held a great review. Buford was, in one of his reports, noted that, they could hear the cannonades and the charging of the horses and everything on the north side of the Rappahannock. And Pleasanton was ordered to take care of the situation by Hooker. And on June 9th, the cavalry divides into two wings, one division going to Kelly's Ford under the command of David McMurtry Gregg, and the second wing under the command of John Buford at Beverly's Ford. And Pleasanton joins Buford at Beverly's Ford. And accompanying Buford's wing are two regiments of infantry, the 2nd Massachusetts and the 3rd Wisconsin. And one of the officers with the 3rd Wisconsin noted the group of staff officers that were clustered around Pleasanton and Buford down at Beverly's Ford. And he noted that the assemblage of the distinguished group of horsemen, these young and gallant hard riders, were full of enthusiasm of the true-bred soldiers they were. Among them was the model chevalier, George Custer. At that time, George Custer was accompanied by a guy that turned out to be a hanger-on for the entire Civil War, a bugler by the name of Joseph Fought. And Fought crossed the Rappahannock with Custer, and they followed in the tracks of the Union advance, which at that time was being led by colonel of the 8th Illinois, who had served out on the Indian frontier. His name was Benjamin F. His name was Grimes, or he was called Grimes, and Grimes Davis. And he's trotting down the road towards the Confederate position, and it's a really narrow road, and there's woods on either side. And before anything can happen, a Confederate steps out from behind a tree and shoots Davis dead. What happened next is one of those things that I talk about being the mythology of Custer. Well, in 1956, Jay Monahan writes a biography of Custer in which he claims that when Custer found out that Davis was dead, then command of the brigade that Davis was leading developed on Custer. A few years later, a guy by the name of D.A. Kingsley writes a very highly romanticized biography called Favor the Bold. And in it, he claims that Davis was a friend of McClellan, and McClellan had given him instructions to let Custer take command of the brigade because he was going to be tested for bigger things. Well, in 1996, historian Jeffrey Wirt finally wrote that that was all a crock, that that situation had never taken place. So this is a case of the mythology that surrounds Custer that makes him out to be larger than life and which had absolutely no basis of reality whatsoever. So Custer never led the charge against the Confederates at St. James's Church. So the next thing we have is a quote from Fought. And Fought's papers were found in the trunks that were part of the Marguerite Merrington collection, and they were in very sad condition. So in modern terms, you would say that Fought's account was very redacted, because when you read it in Marguerite Merrington's book on the Custer story, you see that there's huge gaps in this thing. But one thing that Fought says was, the next thing we did was we went with Colonel Merritt's regiment, and we were in the lead. And this is the attack shown on the top of the top picture of attack on St. James Church. And on the ridge line, it was completely lined with cannon and Confederate cavalry, and the charge was a failure. So one guy ended up writing that, the only thing he remembers is that the 6th Pennsylvania and the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, which is what the 2nd U.S. Dragoons had become in the reorganization that followed the beginning of the war, were boots scooting back to Washington as fast as they could. So the reality is that Custer was a staff officer. His duty was to inform his commanding officer, which in this case was Pleasanton, that Davis was dead and that they needed leadership at the front of the attack. So Custer never led the charge. He was part of the attack on St. James's Church, but did he actually lead the charge? We already know, I've already talked about the fact that Merritt was a stickler for military protocol, that he was a martinet to some extent, that he was a serious soldier. Is it possible that George Custer, a mere staff officer, actually got in front of Merritt and led the charge? As they retreated, Buford decides he's going to let another brigade take the lead, and he takes the reserve brigade, of which Merritt's regiment was a part of, and moves to the right flank of the cavalry. Is it possible? Is this speculation maybe? That during that move to the right side of the cavalry line, that Custer and Merritt exchanged words. They were both hot-tempered when they wanted to be. So there's just, in my mind, there's just no way that Custer could have taken the lead of Merritt's regiment and Merritt could not have said something to Custer about it. So they get to the right flank, and there's a stone wall in front of Buford's men. And the infantry is there, and they're looking at this group of surrounding Buford, who, because he's the general in charge, there's staff officers all around. There's staff officers coming, going. There's a lot of activity around. And Daniel Oakey of the 2nd Massachusetts states, Custer was the most striking figure in the group, with his fanciful uniform, his long hair, and spirited manner. He seemed to enjoy the shelling and appeared to beam all over, almost dancing with excitement. His counterpart in the 3rd Wisconsin was a guy by the name of Edwin Bryant, and he states that Custer was there, his long hair waving in the breeze and his manner full of animation. Another officer would write that Custer showed much interest and evidently would have enjoyed going with us, which was when Buford had ordered Merritt to attack the Confederates behind the stone wall. It's clear that Custer did not participate in that attack on the stone wall. And the reason in my book is because he and Merritt had exchanged words. And here's these two guys, Custer probably believed at that point that he and Merritt were close friends based on their association, the fraternal bond of West Point and the shared hazards of the battlefield. Whereas Merritt was just kind of tired of Custer's boisterousness, his obnoxious personality. Later reports would state that he had come to hate Custer. In the attack against Stonewall, Merritt's 2nd U.S. Cavalry finally makes it over what was a spur of high ground on the north end of Fleetwood Hill, which was the site of the biggest cavalry battle of the war. And he makes it over, and he finds that the Confederates are down there in force, and they're attacking his regiment. And they hit him in the front, and they hit him on the flank, and his regiment just falls apart. And the picture on the bottom shows him he finds himself in the middle of all the Confederates, and in the smoke and the dust and the battle smoke and all that going on, he sees what he believes is a high-ranking Confederate officer, and he points his saber at him and demands his surrender. And the Confederate refuses to surrender and takes a whack at Merritt's head, sends his hat flying, and cuts his forehead. And for all intents and purposes, the Battle of Brandy Station is over, except for the retreat of the Union cavalry back across the Rappahannock River. The next time we see these two is in action on June 17th, and the battles of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, which was the prelude to the Battle of Gettysburg. And as you can see from the map, there's two roads. The road heading toward the northwest is the Snickersville Pike, and the road heading directly west is the one to Ashby's Gap. Now, Custer takes the western road to Ashby's Gap, and Merritt heads north. Now, the ground to the south is more open and more amenable to the actions of mounted cavalry. The area to the northwest is actually more farmed, and there are extensive stone walls and fences, and it's very hard for mounted cavalry to go into action. So a lot of the action on Merritt's part is dismounted. He turns to the carbine, whereas Custer turns to the saber. And one of the more famous engravings that made it into the dailies that were being published in the northern newspapers was this picture of George Custer leading in charge of the 1st Maine Cavalry. And when you see here at the Fur Farm, you can see that the road turns west. And I've been there, and it's still the way it was back then. Right at that area there's a stone wall. And the Confederates had lined that stone wall with sharpshooters and infantry. And the 1st Massachusetts goes up that road, and all of a sudden the Confederates stand up and just totally devastate the 1st Massachusetts. They try again, the Union tries again, same results. They're driven back. Finally, Judson Kilpatrick, who is commanding a brigade, goes up to the 1st Maine, commanded by Colonel Calvin Doughty, and orders Doughty to charge. So here we have Doughty, Kilpatrick, and Custer leading this charge against these perfectly concealed and protected Confederate infantry. And within seconds of the charge, Doughty is killed, and Kilpatrick's horse is killed, and he hits the ground. And Custer is left all by himself in front of the 1st Maine, and soon finds himself, as he says, in the midst of the enemy. Just before the charge, Custer had swung into line, and a Michigan reporter says, suddenly a young officer of Pleasanton's staff came up at a gallop. Waving his broad-brimmed hat, he shouted, 3 cheers for General Kilpatrick. And that's when he joined the charge with Kilpatrick and Doughty. So when both of those go down and he's left all alone, he finds himself in the middle of the Confederates with his broad-brimmed hat. And in the midst of the smoke and the dust and everything, he's taken to be a Confederate and somehow manages to make his escape. On June 28th, shortly after the campaigns of Aldie, Middleburg, and Upperville, the Army of the Potomac issued Special Orders number 28 on June 28, 1863. And then in that order, Wesley Merritt, George Custer, and Elon Farnsworth were promoted to Brigadier General of U.S. Volunteers. Merritt was given command of the Reserve Brigade in John Buford's 1st Cavalry Division, while Farnsworth and Custer took over the 1st and 2nd Brigades, respectively, of the newly designated 3rd Cavalry Division under Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick. Custer's command, the second brigade, became famous as the Michigan Cavalry Brigade. Now, a lot has been made about Custer's luck. Well, you know, what was Custer's luck? The fact that he was in 80 charges and was only wounded one time. The fact that he had 7 horses shot out from under him in the Gettysburg campaign. I mean, all these things of him being in the right place, that promotion came his way. This is not what Custer's luck was. The reality of Custer's luck was that he was appointed to the command of the 5th and the 6th Michigan Brigades, which at that time were the only 2 regiments in the Army of the Potomac that were armed with the 7-shot Spencer repeater. After battles followed at Hanover and Hunterstown, and in those 2 battles, Custer came to realize the efficiency of the 7-shot repeater, and he used it as the core of his tactical philosophy. Now, let me make sure here. I am not here to claim that George Custer was a tactical genius. There were other brigades, other regiments in the Union Army, especially in the Western armies, particularly under Wilder, who also had the Spencer repeater, and they adapted their weapon to the exigencies of the battlefield, and that's what Custer did. He was the first and only soldier in the Army of the Potomac to see the Spencer in action, and he took full advantage of what it had to offer. And that brings us to the Battle of Gettysburg. Just a few days after Custer's promotion, Merritt's promotion, and Farnsworth's promotion. Unfortunately, Farnsworth would be killed in an infamous charge ordered by Kilpatrick against the Confederates on the south side of the Round Tops, and that was it for Farnsworth. But that left Custer and Merritt. Now, Custer's command after the Battle of Hunterstown had moved down to a little cross section called Two Taverns, which was a couple of miles removed from the road from Hanover to Gettysburg. And Kilpatrick's orders were to move his men to his division to the south side of the Round Tops and attack the Confederate right flank on this side of the Round Tops. Farnsworth Brigade had already moved out, and Custer was lined up on the side of the road waiting for Farnsworth to clear the road so he could move his brigade onto the road and head south. And as he's waiting, a staff officer from David McMurtry Gregg's 2nd Cavalry Division approaches him and tells him that Gregg has ordered him to move his command north to the Hanover Road where it met the Low Dutch Road. And this is about 8 o'clock in the morning, and Custer turns his command around and heads north to the Hanover Road and deploys into position facing Gettysburg. At 10 a.m., and well, let's look at the part that Jeb Stuart was to play in this, because obviously the two would clash pretty violently on the 3rd day of Gettysburg. Stuart had been absent from Lee's army for several days, and Lee was pretty upset that he had been left without cavalry. So on the 3rd day of the Battle of Gettysburg, he sends Stuart to go to the Yorktown Road, which is north of Hanover, and to protect the right flank of the left flank of the Confederate army. Of course, Stuart was a little bit of a do it his own way kind of guy, and he wrote in his report that if he saw the opportunity to create havoc in the rear of the Union Army, he was going to take advantage of that and do so. And the picture he's moving along the Yorktown Road for 2.5 miles, and he comes to this little country lane in back of the Rummel and Smith stalwarts farmed. And you can see the trees on the left side. Those are the trees on Cress's Ridge. And Cress's Ridge, you can see on the picture on the right-hand side, is just this ridge that extends all across the back of the field and is completely covered with trees. The only problem was that some of Stuart's men had been seen by Union infantry located on Cemetery Hill, which was, when you go to Gettysburg, you can see that that's a pretty high piece of ground. And they were able to see the dust kicked up by Stuart's men and actually seen a few of the cavalry. Now, Custer was already in place around 9 o'clock, and he has sent out reconnaissances on the left side of the battlefield where we see Little Run, and on the east side of the battlefield along the Low Dutch Road. And it's the men that are on the east side that finally spot Stuart's men. Now, Custer redeploys his men, which had been facing Gettysburg, and faces them towards the Rummel Farm, which is up near the junction of that road there and the Yorktown Pike. And he begins offensive. Well, at 10 a.m., Custer is taken under fire by a battery of 6 guns from the Confederate, from Stuart's cavalry, horse cavalry. And he begins an offensive movement of the 5th and parts of the 6th Cavalry, which were the 2 units that were armed with the Spencer rifle, the Spencer repeater, on the west side of the field, heading towards Rummel's farm. And things it's quite a little skirmish going on here between Custer's men and the men occupying the Rummel's farm buildings. And Custer says, at 10 a.m., our brigade being on the right of the army, the enemy's cavalry under General Stuart appeared in our front. And at this point, James H. Kidd, who commanded a portion of the 6th Michigan, says Custer was reluctant to leave his post. Remember, he had orders from Kilpatrick to head to the south of the Round Tops. He says Custer was reluctant to leave his post, knew he ought not leave it. He had already been attacked by fire from the artillery in position beyond the Rummel buildings. And in the middle of this back and forth action, bugler John Bigelow of the 5th Michigan says, Custer rode in front of our troops and with his flag in one hand and his saber in the other, ordered us forward. Around 1 o'clock, the Confederate cannonade begins that precedes the Pickett, Pettigrew, Trimble charge. And this begins a part of the action on East Cavalry Field. So right now we're going to move real quickly to South Cavalry Field. And we're going to look at what Merritt was doing during, I hope I'm not running out of time here. How am I doing for time, Kelly?
It'd probably be good to finish it pretty soon, so we've got some time for questions.
Okay, yeah, I love questions. Okay, so Merritt is on South Cavalry Field, and he has come up the Emmitsburg Road, and he extends west of the Emmitsburg Road. Now, he had received orders to join Kilpatrick. Since Kilpatrick was missing Custer, Kilpatrick didn't feel comfortable attacking the southern right flank with just one brigade of cavalry. So Merritt's brigade, the reserve brigade, was ordered there. And when he gets there, unfortunately, he has already detached 4 squadrons of the 6th U.S. Cavalry to chase after a reported wagon train of Confederates who were out foraging on the west side. And in the process, those 4 squadrons of men are assaulted by a brigade under the command of Grumble Jones, and is totally decimated. They lose over 240 men and 292 horses. So by the time Merritt and then Merritt's orders had no hint of urgency, any reason to move. And he, being the kind of guy that really looked after his horses, it was kind of like a leisurely march to um, South Cavalry Field. By the time he gets there, the guns were already blasting away in the Pettigrew Trimble charge and picket charge. And no matter what he does, he cannot extend around the Confederate flank because the Confederate commander of that day was Evander Law. He was in command of John Bell Hood's division because Hood had been wounded on the second day. And he keeps pulling men from the Round Top area and extending his line west. And Merritt just can't get around that line. And finally, a brigade of Georgians get there and they deliver this huge volley into Merritt's flank. And Merritt, according to one officer, it says that the stretching process continued until it became fearful that it might be easily broken by a bold cavalry attack. But Merritt never delivered that attack because, as one officer, Frederick Newhall, put it, that confident look, the line had that confident look of being here to stay. And either Merritt called a halt or Law brought him to a stand, just as you may happen to fancy the report of one or the other. And that ended the fight as far as Merritt was concerned. So he did not have a great Battle of Gettysburg. It was actually a pretty mediocre performance on his part. What was possible at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, if he had gotten there fast enough, just wasn't possible, or impossible 2 hours later at 3 o'clock when he finally arrived on the field. In the meantime, things back on East Cavalry Field, and I'm going to wrap it up real quick here. Several things happen. First of all, Custer receives another order from Kilpatrick to get his brigade down south and join Farnsworth Brigade south of the Round Tops. At the same time, they received the reports from the Union infantry that the Confederates are moving behind Cress's Ridge in force, and those are the two brigades of Wade Hampton and Fitzhugh Lee under Jeb Stuart. And finally, General Gregg finally arrives on the field at the junction of the Low Dutch Road and the Hanover Pike, and he assumes command. And at this point, he knows that he cannot withstand a charge by Stuart's two brigades with his one little brigade under the command of John B. McIntosh. So he looks at Custer. When Gregg gets on the field, Custer approaches him and says, after some delay, before I left my position, Brigadier General Gregg, commanding the 2nd Division, arrived. Learning the true condition of affairs in my front, he ordered me to remain in the position I then occupied. Well, Gregg and Custer were both sticklers for military protocol, and Gregg says to him, say you never got the message. I need you here. And Custer replies, I will only be glad to stay if you will give the order. Well, Gregg gave him the order, and since I'm running a little bit low on time here, the rest is history. Custer leads a charge with the 7th Michigan that is an utter disaster. But then when the Confederates finally come across that beautiful open field in the top picture, Custer leads the 1st Michigan in a charge that just cleaves the Confederates in half, while remnants of other Union units attack from both flanks, and eventually the Confederates are routed. And late that evening, it starts to rain, and the bugler, John Bigelow, who seems to have had a very busy day that day, says of Custer, he has been weighed by the men. He is cracking jokes with the rough troopers, and he's sitting on a log, and the rain is pelting down on him. And Bigelow says, an orderly rides up, asks for Custer, and hands him his orders. 1 minute, and the bugle rings out to horse. 'Tis a relief from waiting in the rain. And that begins the pursuit of Lee's beaten army through the mountains and down to the Potomac River. And that's pretty much the story in volume 1. So the last three chapters are the Battle of Gettysburg. My take on the Battle of Gettysburg is different than anything that's been written beforehand, and I'm really proud of it. I put a lot of research into it. I have a very good account of that battle and Custer's part in it. I, for one, admire Greg for the part that he had in deciding to order Custer to the Hanover Road, but I do not believe that Greg set the tone, the pace for the eventual victory that took place on East Cavalry Field. I think it was all Custer's doing at that time. And that's it. And I'll be glad to take any questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And if you want to go ahead and hit stop share, we'll be able
Okay.
to see things a little bit better. But there were a few questions that came in, so I'll get right to those in the interest of time. And
Okay.
Niels has a question. He says, how would you describe Custer's relations with his men as a commander? He said, in a documentary that I watched a long time ago, there was an expert from a member of the 7th Cavalry who said, from a member of the 7th Cavalry who said that Custer made himself out to be utterly obnoxious in the interaction with the men that he had, and that he was a severe disciplinarian.
This is, before, this is the conversation that you and I had before we open up the site to everybody. And the question to that is, we're talking about two different people here. I'm talking about Custer, the Civil Warrior, Custer, the commander of the Michigan Cavalry Brigade, and then the 3rd Cavalry Division and the end of the Appomattox Campaign. This guy's talking about the 7th U.S. Cavalry that fought against the Native Americans on the frontiers and ended up getting beaten to death at the Little Bighorn. Between 1865 and 1876, there's a large gap of time. So what I mentioned to you was that I do not believe that there's been a historian that has managed to connect the dots between Custer in 1865 and Custer in 1876. There were two completely different armies. The Union Army of the Civil War was an army of volunteers that had signed on to preserve the Union and abolish slavery. The men that fought on the frontier against Native Americans were immigrants who were heading west to find a better life, and the army paid for their trip west. Many of them deserted. Many of them couldn't speak English. Many of them were, tough to discipline. So Custer was forced to adapt a different attitude towards his men, towards the men he commanded on the frontier. And that would be my answer. George Custer, the Civil Warrior, we need to connect how he became Custer, the Indian fighter, and how he became obnoxious, strict disciplinarian, hated by his men, hated by his officers. How did that happen? I cannot answer that. It is not my field of study. I am a student of Custer, the Civil Warrior. His men loved him. They loved him in the Michigan Brigade, and they loved him in the 3rd Cavalry. And that's the last paragraph. He had been weighed by his men, and he was not found lacking. They loved him. And, that would be the answer to Nils' question, was there's two different Custers. We need to connect the dots somehow, or someone needs to connect the dots, because it's not going to be me.
Well, thank you. And that is very interesting. It would be fascinating to find out why he kind of changed in his command style.
Well, the Army changed. The Army changed. The Army
changed. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Yeah,
and
that
he
would
was
make a
forced to
difference.
adapt to the new Army.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, it did not bring out his best qualities.
Well, very interesting. And Nick has a question. This was from earlier in your talk, and he says, is there too much weight put on the fact that Custer was last in his class in 1861? after all 23 classmates had dropped out for academics and 22 resigned to join the Confederacy.
Well, in a way, that kind of answers his question. Custer himself, in his unfinished memoirs, said that he graduated 34, bottom man in his class. But he clearly says, if the Southern boys hadn't resigned, there was a couple of Southern boys that would have definitely disputed him for the bottom man in his class. He was bottom man in his class because only 34 cadets were left out of a class of, 60 something cadets. So he claims that there were a couple of Southerners that if they had stayed and honored their oath to the Union, that they would have graduated bottom man in the class instead of him. But the fact is, he never paid attention to his scholastics. He was too busy having fun. One guy described him as being, the most happy-go-lucky guy in the class. Everybody loved him. Southerners, Northerners, everybody loved him. And for the rest of his life, Custer would love his Southern classmates. At the end of the Civil War, he runs into one of his classmates, and here he is, a major general in command of a cavalry division, and he meets his classmate, and one guy records that they're rolling around on the ground like a couple of schoolboys in joy. So he was the last man in his class. Yes, he flirted continuously, but when he got to that 99 demerit, then he would not create another demerit that would force his removal from the academy. So he got the 99, and then he had the discipline to keep from getting that last demerit that would have ended his career. So yes, he was the bottom man of his class, but he was the last Union man of his class. Maybe a Southern guy would have been bottom man.
And I'm going to take one last question that just came in from Fernando. He says, regardless of historical inaccuracy, what is your favorite movie about Custer and why?
Well, obviously, and we talked about this too, my favorite movie about Custer, and the movie that got me completely engaged in the subject of George Custer, was Errol Flynn in They Died with Their Boots On. And yes, there was nothing historically accurate about that movie, but there was something about the roguish aspect that Flynn gave to the role of Custer that has been like nothing that has been shown in a movie concerning the true nature of his fun-loving pranksterism. He had his brother with him. They would play pranks on each other all the time. But there was no movie that captured the essence of George Custer like They Died with Their Boots On. The fact that the movie was completely historically inaccurate, that's irrelevant. You can watch Little Big Man or all these others, the story that Custer just needed one more victory and then he would run for president of the United States. And that's all part of the Custer mythology, So in answer to Fernando's question, obviously it was Errol Flynn's portrayal of George Custer that got me into studying George Custer. And I've been studying him since I watched that in Cuba in the late 50s with subtitles. And that's when I first saw it. It was in Cuba back in the, during the revolution and stuff like that.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. And if those of you out there who are viewing, if you're interested to learn more about George Custer and Wesley Merritt, buy the book. It's available in our gift shop, so you could go to acwm.org, and it's also available on the Savas Beatty website. So,
or you can get it from me directly. I'll be glad to sign the book.
Okay.
And you have my address or email, and they can always contact me through email.
I do. So yes, that's another way to purchase the book. So thank you all for viewing tonight. Thank you so much, Mr. Ovies, and everyone have a lovely evening.
Okay, if there's anybody that wants to ask me any questions, further questions, I'll be glad to hang on for a little while. That's up to whether you can handle this thing or not. But I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Well, thank you, and this was a very informative presentation, so we appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Kelly.
Good
And good
night.
night to everybody. Thank you for listening.